the Ukrainian move was impressive. And Trump's silence, uncharacteristic, suggests, to me anyway, that he is impressed by this.
I'm joined today by Daniel Freed, a former Assistant Secretary of State for Europe. Thank you for talking today.
Thanks for having me.
Today marks the end of the first week of Trump's 2-week notice, in which Putin needed to prove he's not, quote, tapping the president. Is Russia's recent peace demands that they released recently convincing enough for Trump that he's not being tapped along, or is it sufficient enough maybe that he could now blame Ukraine at least and walk away, do you think?
Um, I don't know whether the Russian position is persuasive for Trump, but I know for anybody else, with knowledge of the background of this war, it is not persuasive. The Russians have not moved. They are demanding basically Ukraine's capitulation. It is not serious. Now, I have many years' experience dealing with the Kremlin. The Russians can not negotiate forever, if that's what they choose, but they can choose to negotiate, at which point they can be quite skilled at reaching a deal. They have not reached that point. And from Putin's perspective, that is a rational choice. Putin has every expectation that the United States will fold, we will abandon Ukraine, that the Europeans won't maintain their strength, and that he can get everything. However, it is possible that Trump, as he has suggested, will decide he's tired of being played by Putin, that the Ukrainians are actually cooperative, which in fact they are, and that it is time to increase the pressure on Putin. I've just come from almost a week in Ukraine, Odessa, Mykolaiv, and Kyiv. The Ukrainians are determined to fight on. Their assessment of their position varies, but they are determined to keep up the fight because, as they put it, the alternative is national extermination, that they would be under the Russian boot forever. But some of them also believe that a deal is possible, and they are prepared to work with Trump's plan. They actually are grateful to Trump because they think that he has opened up the door to diplomacy and a negotiated settlement if he pushes the Russians now. Happily, he has the instruments to do so. And by the way, the British and French, with the talk now a little bit thinner of a deterrent force, have opened the door for greater security for Ukraine. So Trump is in a position to drive home a bargain which is not just, that is, it won't get all the Russians out of Ukraine, but it could be lasting. It could provide for the security and stability of, let's say, free Ukraine, unoccupied Ukraine. And Ukraine, under these circumstances, could become the West Germany of this century, which was a raw deal for East Germany and an ultimate success. So that's the way I tend to look at this. Much depends on Trump's next move. Of course, Putin's tapping him along, to use Trump's own phrase. And I think that Trump on some level realizes it, but he's trying to, if you want to be charitable, and not everyone is, if you want to be charitable, Trump is trying to entice Putin and keep the threat of additional sanctions a little bit under the horizon so that they can work a deal. The Ukrainians are clearly prepared to do so, but they're not going to surrender. They are very tough. I was in Ukrainian cities that are under a lot of pressure, nightly air raids, daily air raids, and Ukrainians are tough. It's what I've read about Londoners during the Blitz. I mean, right, that old phrase, keep calm and carry on, right? I actually saw it. People go to the bomb shelters when there's a threat of a ballistic missile, and then they go back to work. They are not shaken because being scared is not going to help, and Russia's terms are no terms that they can accept. So Trump could land a deal But to do it, he's got to increase the pressure on Putin, as well as keep the negotiating track open. And there are some of Trump's people who see that. There are other people who would like to abandon Ukraine for no particularly good reason. But that's another discussion.
Do you think the offer of a 2 or 3 day ceasefire to retrieve bodies from the battlefield and a peace proposal that is like, still tantamount to Ukrainian surrender and obviously not acceptable to the Ukrainian people? Do you think that is enough for Trump to not feel like he's being tapped along anymore in that sort
Um,
of?
Well, that is the question. The Russians so far appear to be doing the minimum they have to do to keep Trump from lowering the hammer. And Trump is, if he is as good a negotiator as he claims to be, he ought to realize this. Of course, there is also the possibility that Putin will determine that the deal on the table is it to his advantage to take. That is, the Ukrainians, by hitting the Russian strategic bombers, have shown that they, in fact, do have some military assets. They've hit the Kerch Strait Bridge. They're not about to crumble. The Russians are going to push on land in Pokrovsk and Sumy. They could have success. Putin may be counting on that. But the pressure on Russia is mounting. Their economy is not in good shape, and we have the ability to make it in much worse shape. So Putin could take the deal. But from his perspective, it's rational to hold out for total victory as long as he thinks that Trump will cave. Therefore, much depends on Trump sending the message to Putin, maybe quietly, if Trump thinks doing it publicly won't work. The message should be, however, give it up. We are in this to help Ukraine succeed and do the deal because it's going to get worse for you. I don't know that Trump will do that, but he could do that.
Do you think that the success and the sort of the shall we say the show that Ukraine has made of the drone strike on Russian bombers and indeed the attack on the Crimea Bridge, do you think those Trump once said that Ukraine has no cards to play? They've quite clearly shown that they do have at least some up their sleeve. Do you think this will have earned some respect and maybe a little bit of more goodwill on the part of the Trump administration?
I don't know about goodwill, but the Ukrainian move was impressive. And Trump's silence, uncharacteristic, suggests, to me anyway, that he is impressed by this. Now, a couple of his people and many people in Trump world have said, oh, this is dangerous escalation by Ukraine. But for God's sakes, that is not really a serious position. Um, I think Trump's silence is actually not a bad way to play this. He just lets it hang out there. The Ukrainians have shown great skill, and by the way, they have a remarkable capacity to modernize drones. They're going to have a lot of success in the arms industry when the British, French, Germans, and Americans start trying to do joint ventures with them. And they know it. I had some of these discussions in Kyiv. So how can I put this? The game is afoot. There are various possibilities out there which are not bad for Ukraine. It's not a just peace. It won't be just until all the Russians are out of Ukraine and Russia's paying reparations. But it could be a lasting peace and a strategic success for us all. Um, we're not there yet, though. And the Trump administration and Trump himself is going to have to decide that he actually wants to push this to success. And by the way, we would be well advised to start opening up greater possibilities for support for the U.S. For the French British coalition of the willing. I don't know that sending a couple of brigades to the middle of Ukraine is the right way to do it, but um, there's been some talk of air defense uh, from from the Allies, and they could do it. If you combine the resources, that would make a big difference, and it would show Putin that he has in fact underestimated the West, not for the first time, and it could be the key to a lasting peace. And Trump should support this, I think.
With Ukraine's expertise in drones, do you think this could be yet again another card for Ukraine to play this time for Trump, saying, well, obviously, if we lose, we're not going to have any expertise to really share with you. So would you want to help Ukraine a little bit more and we'll give you the expertise that we've developed and proven on the battlefield?
The Ukrainian drone technology is something we ought to be eager to get a hold of. It is useful not just in Europe, but in Asia. If you want, I've had military people tell me that if you want to thwart a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, one way to do it is to develop massive quantities of inexpensive drones, sea and air, and deploy them. Mess with a possible Chinese invasion and let it be known that you're ready to do so. The Ukrainian technological cycle is, as is the case in wartime, much shorter than ours, right? We're doing weapons development in peacetime conditions. They're not. Wartime conditions are fast. Peacetime conditions aren't. And we have the capital, the ability to expand. They have the technology and the expertise. So that's something Trump can understand. You want strength, go to the people who've shown it.
Do you think that some of Trump's rhetoric on, again, the tapping along and are we being sort of led into the long grass? Do you think that is in some way to counteract any larger incursions from Russia? There's been reports of troops massing on the northern edge of Ukraine. Is that something that would be, or Putin would be put off from doing? Because surely that would be an indication that there is that the things are not cooling down or going towards peace.
President Trump has tiptoed up to the point of heavy sanctions against Russia. He then backs away from it. There are different schools of thought. Some people think that Trump is jerking around the Ukrainians and has no intention of standing up to Putin and he's going to abandon Ukraine. Many of my friends believe that, and there is a basis for that. However, I maybe with an excess of charity believe that Trump could, in fact, decide that he wants the win. And the win is to back Ukraine and put pressure on Russia, and then be able to say, I, Donald Trump, gave Putin every chance. He didn't take it, and I'm sorry, we're just going to have to squeeze a little further. Now, this changes if the Russians have a breakthrough on the ground, right? I don't think they will, but it doesn't matter what I think. That is a possibility. Although I have read articles for the last 2 years about an imminent Russian breakthrough, and it never turns out to actually occur. I am somewhat skeptical about that. I don't rule it out, but I am somewhat skeptical. The Ukrainians I spoke to have a range of opinions, but none of them expects the Russians to overwhelm the Ukrainians and do what? March into Kiev, cross the Dnipro. They don't seem to have the forces for that. That said, oh, it doesn't matter what I think. Stuff will happen and Putin may give it a try. But think of this. If Putin launches a huge ground assault and it fails, he could be under pressure. We tend to think of the Russians as united in the kind of hysterical, radical, nationalist rhetoric we hear. I don't know that that's true. The economy is in bad shape, the casualties are high, and we know from the Soviet period that Russians are perfectly capable of a kind of two-faced approach. What they say in public, what they know they have to say in public, and what they think in private. And that gap can be dangerous and can prove a vulnerability. We don't know when.
And just finally, although NATO has recently said, again, reaffirmed that Ukraine will not be given membership, certainly anytime soon, if just flat out at all. Zelensky was extended, or Ukraine was extended an invitation to the next NATO meeting. Certainly a symbolic move, I think. But what message is this trying to send, do you think?
It suggests that the United States is not as ready to throw Ukraine under the bus as some have feared or hoped. And I've heard a couple of weeks ago, I heard the US ambassador to NATO, who's close to Trump, say that he expected Zelensky to be at the NATO summit in one capacity or another. It turns out he was right. I suspect he was working for this. So it is, I'm not part of Trump world, okay? Like at all. But I can still see in Trump's policy the possibility, though not a certain one, of a successful outcome.
Daniel Freed, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.